Hello, and welcome to this first meeting of the Barbados Genealogy Group for 2023. I greet those of you joining us on Zoom, as well as those on Facebook Live. My name is Harriet Pierce, and I'm the coordinator for the group, which has been in existence since 2014. Today, we welcome Dr. Rosalind Russell, who will speak on the topic, Connecting Oceans, Barbadians in Australia. And by the way, Rosalind is speaking to us from Australia. Just a bit about the talk. While Barbados and Australia are distinct geographically, they share considerable historical connections through their former status as colonies of the British Empire. The vast imperial network saw movements of people within this context, including individuals and families who came to Australia from Barbados and made their mark in this new country. Familiar Barbadian names such as Gibbs, Aline, Montefiore, we all know of the Fountain, also appear in Australia in influential contexts. Did you know that the cultivation of sugarcane in Queensland, a major primary industry there, was pioneered by a Barbadian? Rosalind will tell you more about that. This presentation explores these historical links between our two nations and provides suggestions on how to research the lives of Barbadians who have lived in Australia. Just a bit about our speaker. Rosalind Russell is an Australian historian and museum consultant who is no stranger to Barbados. From 2006 to 2020, she worked on developing content for the Museum of Parliament and the National Heroes Gallery of Barbados, the Exchange Interactive Center, and our spanking new Children's Gallery here at the museum. She was co-editor with our director, Alessandra Cummins, and Deputy Kevin Farmer of Plantation to Nation, a Caribbean museums and national identity. And she contributed a chapter on museums in Barbados. Rosalind is a former chair of the International Advisory Committee of the UNESCO Memory of the World Program, and is a member of its Register Subcommittee and Subcommittee on Education and Research. From 2013 to 2022, she chaired the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee. She is also a board member with our director, Alessandra Cummins, of the International Center for Documentary Heritage, located in Korea. Just before we give the mic to Rosalind, I just want to remind everyone to save your questions until the end, and you can type your questions in the Q&A. Or you can use the raise hand feature if you want to speak on mic, and we will unmute you. Any comments that are not questions, just enter those in the chat. So let's sit back and hear all about Barbadians in Australia from Rosalind. Rosalind?
Thank you, Harriet, for your introduction. And it's very good to be back in Barbados, even if only virtually. Sitting in my home here in Canberra, Australia. It's very good to be able to talk on this topic too, because it's not something that people immediately think about, that Australia and Barbados would have strong connections, but we've found quite a few over the years, and I'll be talking about those today. So let's move on to the next slide. Thanks, Harriet. Thank you. So as we said before, Barbados and Australia are very distant geographically. It's a long, long way from where I am to where you are. But we do have these considerable historical connections because we're both former colonies of the British Empire. And the empire was a tremendously connected world. The imperial network saw people coming from one place to the other, often with official appointments, but often just with family and financial links. And some of them, in fact, came from Barbados to Australia, and they made their marks here. And there were often other contexts as well, which play a part in the story, particularly the connection back to the United Kingdom, to Europe, and the other parts of the Atlantic and Pacific worlds. So we do see a movement of people back and forth often from Australia, from Barbados to England to Australia, and back the other way. And sometimes some of these people actually stayed here and made a tremendous mark, and their descendants are still here today, and the impact and influence is still to be seen in some of our institutions here today, and I'll go into that later in the talk. So next slide, thanks, Harriet. Quick history lesson here about the colonial beginnings of this country, Australia. And they started in 1788, effectively, when a fleet of 11 ships arrived on the east coast of what's now called Australia, carrying military guards and convicted felons to establish a British penal settlement on the lands of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation of Australia's Indigenous people. This action was conducted without the permission of the Indigenous people, making today, still today in Barbados, 26th of January, which is called Australia Day here, a controversial date. And if you follow Australian news, you will know that there's been many demonstrations and protests about the colonisation of Australia without the permission of the Indigenous people, which happened, of course, across the world, but particularly something that's resonating with us today in Australia. Governor Arthur Phillip, who was a Royal Navy captain, raised the British flag at Sydney Cove in early February 1788, beginning the process of colonising the vast landmass and giving the penal colony that established in Sydney the name of New South Wales. And you see a picture there of a rather idealised representation of the raising of the British flag at Sydney Cove in 1788. The process continued, of course. Other colonies were established on the Australian continent throughout the 19th century. Tasmania, the little island you see at the bottom of the screen, in 1804. Western Australia, right over the other side on the Indian Ocean, in 1829. The Port Phillip district became Victoria, which is this yellow piece down here, in around about sort of the early decades of the 19th century, then became a state in its own right, colony in its own right in 1851. South Australia was established in 1836, and so on. It went on as Queensland, because it was originally a colony of part of New South Wales and was separated in 1859. So we have a number of different governments. Some of them achieved self-government at various points through the 19th century. And of course, in 1901, the 6 Australian colonies of the British Empire became the Commonwealth of Australia. The convict era came to an end in the mid-19th century. The last convicts came out in the 1840s. But by that time, there'd been many, many migrants coming out, particularly from the British Isles and Ireland. It became a centre for migration, a new land. There was land available. There was assisted migration, and the process was accelerated by the discovery of gold in New South Wales, Victoria, and Western Australia from the 1850s. And there was a huge gold rush that brought a massive increase in population from Europe particularly, and from America. The Australian colonies and their growing prosperity attracted people and money from across the empire. And some of those who came to Australia were instrumental in a number of nation-building enterprises, including some notable individuals with links to Barbados. So this imperial network sucked people into the stream of money that went back and forth from moneyed people in Barbados to moneyed people in the United Kingdom, and then out to Australia to invest. And some of these, of course, were people whose names you will be familiar with from being Barbadian. So back to Barbados, the Gibbs family. Members of the Gibbs family were settled in Barbados as early as 1635. And Thomas Gibbs was a member of the first council in Barbados. Sir Philip Gibbs became the first baronet Gibbs. And in 1788, the significant date for Australia, struck what is considered to be the first Barbadian coin, the pineapple penny. He had the currency made for his own trading in Barbados. The reason I've put this slide up here and talked about the pineapple penny is that money and currency and revenue is going to be a very big part of the story of what I'm talking about tonight, particularly in relation to the Gibbs family, but also in other families as well. So back to Australia, or back to England, in fact, first of all, to Colonel John George Nathaniel Gibbs. And there's a quote here from one of Colonel Gibbs's descendants. Colonel Gibbs was the urbane descendant of multiple generations of Barbados sugar barons and a reputed bastard son of Frederick, Duke of York. And I have an article here from the Australian Customs History Journal a few years ago, written by Stephen Gibbs, who explains a bit more about that. He said John George Nathaniel Gibbs was born in London on 30th of March 1787. He was the illegitimate child of George III's second son, Frederick, Duke of York, who 11 years later would become Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. His unwed mother was Agnes Gibbs, the daughter of Sir Philip Gibbs, a wealthy baronet and sugar planter whose chairmanship of the West India Planters and Traders Association had provided Agnes with an entree to the royal court. Sir Philip took elaborate steps to preserve the reputation of his fallen, in inverted commas, daughter, arranging for her clandestine baby to be raised by a kinsman, John Gibbs of Barbados, who agreed to act as his nominal father. So John George Nathaniel Gibbs, although born on what they call the wrong side of the blanket, did enjoy the privileges of growing up as a member of the family, and of course was given the proper sort of education in Britain. He served in the Napoleonic Wars. Then in 1819 became Collector of Customs in Jamaica. This didn't work out so well. He didn't find the climate in Jamaica to his good for his health. So he went back to England, to Great Yarmouth, but he wasn't earning as much money in Great Yarmouth as he was in Jamaica. And he was already had a growing family that eventually became 8 children. And he swapped places with the Collector of Customs for New South Wales in 1833. And he and his wife Elizabeth came out to Australia with 7 of their 8 children. And they mixed in the higher social circles. They were part of colonial aristocracy, if you like, in Australia. 2 of their children married into wealthy colonial families. Their son William married the daughter of Sir John Jamieson, who had a huge property at a place called Penrith, called Regentville, and their daughter Mary married Terence Aubrey Murray, who was a wealthy landowner in the area where I'm sitting today, Yarralumla, on the limestone plains, about 100 miles southwest of Sydney. So that they say married advantageously. They also mixed in the higher circles. Gibbs was a Crown nominee on the Legislative Council of New South Wales. So these people are high society in the small colonial context. Nevertheless, things did not go so smoothly for our friend Colonel Gibbs. He had a fairly inefficient department. He had a burgeoning economy. There was smuggling scandals quite often in the customs section. So a huge coastline to police. And at one stage, there was a smuggling scandal that involved a ship called, of all things, the Fair Barbadian, which I thought was quite interesting. But the one that really scuppered Colonel Gibbs's career as Collector of Customs involved his own son. His son William had become involved in a complicated smuggling racket called the Louisa Affair after a ship that was involved with it. And he was charged and convicted of smuggling. And of course, although Colonel Gibbs was not directly implicated and they couldn't prove that he had anything to do with it, he was forced to retire from his position of Collector of Customs. Before he did that, though, he had built some quite spectacular properties in Sydney, one of which was called Watonga. But then he had to sell that to buy another one when he was out of money. And this particular property was purchased by the government. It became Admiralty House and is now the official Sydney residence of the Governor-General of Australia. This is not the first example of a Gibbs property becoming something so elevated as a viceregal residence. So Colonel Gibbs has to leave his job. Where does he go? Well, he comes here, almost exactly where I'm sitting now. He comes to Yarralumla, the suburb where I'm living. Yarralumla is the site of the official residence of the Governor-General now. But in those days, it was part of one of the large sheep pastoral properties that made up the Canberra region on the limestone plains, as I said, about 100 miles out of Sydney. It was divided up into these properties, which later were resumed, of course, and became the Australian Capital Territory, the seat of government of Australia. But at that stage, they were all pastoral properties. The property was bought by Augustus Gibbs, the younger son of Colonel Gibbs and Elizabeth Gibbs, in 1859. And he bought it from his former brother-in-law, Terence Aubrey Murray, whose wife Mary, Augustus's sister, and Colonel Gibbs and Mrs. Gibbs's daughter had died quite horribly in childbirth the year before. It was later sold to Frederick Campbell of Duntroon, another one of the very significant properties here, in 1881, although Gibbs held a part mortgage on the property till 1911. So that they were here a long time. Colonel Gibbs and his wife, after he retired as Collector of Customs, came to live at Yarralumla in 1859. They came with all their bags and baggages. They came with cartloads of furniture, because this was where I am now, was very much the back blocks, very much the fairly rudimentary services. And they made sure that they had everything they needed before they came out here. They even brought their 2 coffins. They brought 2 cedar coffins, and they used them as clothes chests until they were actually needed. And they weren't needed for quite a long time. So Augustus Gibbs and his kin enjoyed the longest association with Yarralumla of any family of Canberra pioneers. So the Gibbs family were a significant family who occupied what is now, of course, the viceregal property. That's a picture there of the current government house in Yarralumla, which is probably about 2 kilometres up the road from where I'm sitting. It's not the house that Gibbs built, but it's built on the same site. So this property, of course, now has huge significance as at the seat of our Governor-General. The Gibbs family are also very much present in a church called St. John the Baptist. This is the oldest little church on the limestone plains, built in 1845, before anyone ever thought of Canberra as the national capital. It's a little village, and of course it had its village church, the same sort of thing as they had in England, and of course as you have in Barbados, those parish churches, exactly the same kind of thing. And the Gibbs, first of all, Colonel and Mrs. Gibbs, when they died in the 1870s, were buried in the vault at Yarralumla, but Augustus Gibbs moved their bodies into the churchyard at St. John's, where they worshipped, and you'll see that their grave markers there, including Sir Colonel John George Nathaniel Gibbs. There's one on each side for Mrs. Gibbs, Colonel Gibbs, and Augustus Gibbs in the churchyard at St. John the Baptist in Canberra. We move swiftly to the 20th century, and I didn't know until I was working on this project that one of Australia's greatest air aces was a member of the Gibbs family. Bobby Gibbs, the most decorated of all Australian air aces in the world in World War II. He was longest serving wartime commanding officer of the No. 3 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. He flew in the Middle East and became commanding officer in the Western Desert and earned a number of decorations. And then he came to the Southwest Pacific after the Japanese entered the war. And then he spent many years in New Guinea developing the local industry, and he became a member Order of the Australia Award, and continued to fly until the age of 85. He was an extraordinary man. And I worked many years ago on a project at the Australian War Memorial called the Keith Murdoch Sound Archive of Australia in World War II. And we interviewed Bobby Gibbs. And his interview was wonderful. And it was to meet him again in this context was really fascinating. And you see a picture of him there. He was called very much what they call a typical Aussie larrikin, quite a fairly interesting character. There's a picture of a Kitty Hawk plane that he flew, and a portrait bust of Bobby Gibbs, one of which is in the Australian War Memorial, and the other one is in the Royal Air Force Museum in Hendon in the United Kingdom. And of course, the last thing is a plaque that's also sited in St John's Churchyard in Canberra, memorialising Bobby Gibbs. The Gibbs family is very close-knit and keeps its history together. So when Bobby Gibbs died at age 90 in 2007, his memorial was put with the Gibbs family memorials in that plot in St John's Church in Reid in Canberra. Finally, Stephen Gibbs. He's the man whose article I quoted from earlier. He was a journalist and political advisor. He was passionate about researching the role of the Gibbs family in Australian history. And he wrote a scholarly draft of a book that centred on Colonel John George Nathaniel Gibbs, which sadly has never been published, unfortunately. I met Stephen Gibbs many years ago. I actually edited the Customs Journal, and I spoke to him in Sydney. Unfortunately, I didn't know then about his Barbadian connections. Otherwise, I would have talked to him about them. But I have other information about him. He died of cancer, sadly, in 2011. But before he did, he came to Barbados to see the land of his ancestors. And he went to Gibbs Bay or Gibbs Beach, and he tossed an Australian 10-cent coin into the waters. And so the story of currency comes full circle, from Sir Philip Gibbs and the pineapple penny to the revenue raising of the Customs Service and under Colonel Gibbs, back to our Aussie 10-cent coin that was tossed in by Stephen Gibbs into the water to symbolically unite, bring his family story together in the place where his ancestors came from. And maybe it's still there today. If someone turns up an Australian coin, that's probably where it came from. So leaving the Gibbs family now and moving on to someone with a similar name, clearly a distant relative, is Haynes Gibbs Alleyne. And Haynes Gibbs Alleyne was born in Barbados to John Gay Alleyne and his wife Joanna. And he studied medicine in Edinburgh, then rattled around the world for a while, then finally came to New South Wales in 1838. And he had his medical qualifications, and he became a public health figure. He began in 1851. He was appointed coroner at Liverpool, and then health officer at Port Jackson, which is, of course, what Sydney Harbour is officially called, in 1852. And his job was to go onto all the ships and to check the crews and any passengers to make sure they weren't bringing any diseases, send them to the quarantine station if they had anything wrong with them. And he occupied many other positions in hospitals and charitable boards over his lifetime. He also lectured at the University of Sydney in medicine. And he also had another sideline as a naturalist. He was an ichthyologist. He studied fish, and he made a significant study of the fish of the Port Jackson, Sydney Harbour area. So he had made quite a significant contribution, not only to public health. He introduced chloroform to Sydney. He used new techniques of in disease prevention to stop various epidemics, treated people with unusual treatments that were successful. And so it was really quite a significant public health figure in Sydney. He died in 1882 of a stroke very suddenly, and is buried in St Leonard's Cemetery, which is a northern suburb of Sydney. And Alleyne Street in the Sydney suburb of East Chatswood is named after him. So he was sufficiently significant to not only merit an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, which much of the information has come from, but also a street name, which in Australia is quite something. So another a name that resonates in Barbados. Of course, the Aline name is very strong, as I know from my time in Barbados. And so therefore it's reproduced here in Sydney in honour of Haynes Gibbs Aline. And now we get to our sugar pioneer, John Buho. And John Buho came to Australia in 1851, I think, and 1862, sorry, and immediately became involved with the sugar industry. Sugar cane was being grown in the Botanic Gardens in Brisbane. You'll know the history of Botanic Gardens is in the colonies, particularly, is very much about what I call economic botany. The Kew Gardens in the UK coordinated a huge network of botanic gardens, including the one, of course, in St. Vincent that the breadfruit came to from the Providence voyage, for acclimatizing crops for economic value. And clearly they grew sugarcane in Brisbane to see if sugarcane could also be grown in the more tropical regions of Australia, of course, as it had been grown so successfully in the West Indies. And John Buho was a sugar boiler. He was the son of a merchant, but he also had worked in the sugar industry in Barbados, and he was the first person to make sugar from cane grown in the colony of Queensland. So he basically showed people it could be done. Here's your cane that has been introduced via the Botanic Gardens. This is how you make it into sugar. And unfortunately, it was then a lot of people, of course, got in on the game. They started plantations. Sugar became, and still is, a major primary industry in Queensland. And poor old John Buho was a bit sidelined. He kept trying to say, look, I'm the person who showed you how to do this, how to make sugar, and to make an economic proposition. And he had a struggle all his life to be recognised, and they wouldn't even give his wife a pension, which was very sad. But 100 years later, the Queensland sugar industry recognised his efforts. They got together with the Historical Society of Queensland, and they put up you can see it there on the screen, a little memorial plaque to the first sugar being publicly produced in Queensland by John Buho from locally grown canes. So he's a very significant figure, and he's the person who showed them how to make the sugar. And unfortunately, in his lifetime, he was rather sidelined, but posthumously, he has been recognised as a very important figure in pioneering sugar, the sugar industry, which, as I say, is still a major concern, particularly in the tropical areas of above Queensland, more northerly than Queensland, but certainly up towards North Queensland is still a huge industry. So it's still as I said, a big industry. What it did, of course, was to also change the demographic of Australia to a certain extent. And you'll recognise this story from what happened in the West Indies. Sugar plantations were established and indentured labourers were brought from the South Pacific, such as the Solomon Islands, from Tokelau, Gilbert and Ellice Islands, now Kiribati and Tuvalu, were brought to the cane fields to work. At first, this was by a horrible practice known as blackbirding, which is essentially kidnapping people and bringing them there to work on the plantations, and then by a more regulated system of indentured labour. So you see the book you see there is one of the registers of indentured labourers held in the Queensland State Archives. This is these registers are now entered on the Asia Pacific Register for Memory of the World as significant documents from the Asia Pacific. The Queensland South Sea Islander labour trade between 1863 and 1904 has substantial cultural, economic and political impact both within and outside Australia. The 62,000 people came here to work as indentured labourers for a cheap workforce, particularly in the sugarcane area. And they did go back to their islands and they did take their money, but a lot of them stayed here there was quite a considerable controversy over the presence of South Sea Islander labourers in Australia around the time of Federation, when what they called the White Australia policy was being put in place. And many went back then, but there's quite a substantial community still exists and is growing in Australia. So the South Sea Islander community, Pacifica community, is one of our significant communities in the Australian demographic that comes from this period that was started by John Buho, boiling sugar and kicking off the sugar industry in Queensland. Now we get to the Montefiore family, and these are a big story. The Montefiore family, of course, are global. I mean, they are the quintessential transnational family. They are financiers, philanthropists, administrators, and artists, and they've been playing a role across the world from at least the 18th century until right to the present. The family's been based variously in London, in Barbados, in Brussels, and from the mid-19th century in Australia. They, of course, came to Barbados as part of the movement of Sephardic Jewish people who came from Brazil in the 17th century, and of course they became prominent in Barbados. Sir Moses Montefiore in London was a noted 19th century philanthropist. Simon Sebag Montefiore is a contemporary historian whose books you can buy all over the place. He's a very well-known historian to this day. And the Montefiore name, of course, is commemorated in Bridgetown in the Montefiore Fountain. And the graveyard of the Nite Israel Synagogue contains several graves of Montefiore family members. But they divided their time very much between Barbados and London. So some members of the family are going back and forth quite regularly. And then, of course, they started to come to Australia. And you find their names in quite extraordinary places. I was working last year in a place called Wellington, which is about 6 hours drive from Canberra, so central Western New South Wales. I was working with their museum. And I came across this display, the Lion of Waterloo Hotel Montefiore's. I said, oh, Montefiore. Okay, I know that name. And it was the name of a village. It was established by Joseph Barrow Montefiore, who came to Australia in 1830, intending to invest in the wool industry and in agricultural pursuits. And he created this little village on the banks of the Macquarie River. And it's a very strategic spot. It was a spot where the river was crossed by a bridge, and the traffic going further west would go across that bridge, including Australia's iconic Cobb and Co coaches were crossed at that particular crossing, a very strategic place. And a public house was erected, the Lion of Waterloo Hotel. Wellington, of course, is named after the Duke of Wellington, and of course he was known as the Lion of Waterloo. That establishment is still operating today. It's been going since that time, and there's a little clay model of it in the Wellington Museum. And the village wasn't terribly successful. His first venture was not. There was a big economic depression in the 1840s, and he lost a lot of money and went back to England. But of course, the little village stayed. And when I said, "Oh, it's called Montefiore's," and the people at Wellington said to me, "Oh, we call it Montefiores," which is a classic example of Australians making less syllables for anything they ever pronounce. So what we would call Montefiores, the locals call Montefiores, and it's, as I say, it's still there today, and you can go on a historic trail. This was Joseph Barrow Montefiore's first venture in Australia. It wasn't the last. So there's three members of the family who are very significant in Australian history. Joseph Barrow, of course, Montefiore, of course, Jacob Levi Montefiore, and his brother Eleazar Levi Montefiore. They all played significant roles, not just in the financial life of Australia, but also in the cultural life. Joseph and his nephew Jacob Montefiore were both supporters of the colonisation scheme that set up the colony of South Australia in the 1830s. South Australia has the distinction of being the only colony in Australia to be settled by free people. All the others were settled by as penal colonies, but South Australia was an idealistic exercise. It was a colonisation project founded on the principles of a man called Edward Gibbon Wakefield. This was how you set up a colony using free people. And South Australians are very proud of the fact that they don't have any convicts in their ancestry. He wasn't successful, as I said before, with Montefiore's and other enterprises. He went back to England after the Depression of the 80s, but then came back again and went into business with Eleazar Montefiore, who I'll more of in a minute. As importers and shipping agents, Eleazar Montefiore had come to Australia. Joseph Montefiore also held positions in many companies and banks. He was very successful in his second time in Australia, as was a member of the Adelaide Stock Exchange. But in his 50s, he decided he'd had enough. He'd done enough developing in Australia, and he went back to England in 1860. But he was very significant in the financial sector. Jacob Levi Montefiore was also a merchant financier and a leading member of Sydney's business community. Again, he was involved in a number of different enterprises, very complex across the range of businesses and financial institutions. He and his wife arrived in Sydney in 1837, but he also wrote plays. He was a playwright, and he penned an operatic libretto, Don John of Austria, which was set to music by Australia's first composer, Isaac Nathan, and performed in 1847. There's a picture there of Jacob Levi Montefiore. Isaac Nathan, of course, was another Jewish settler in Australia, very famous. So the Jewish community in Australia has a very big investment in the story of the Montefiore family. They are a fascinating family. They're also involved, they didn't put it on the slide, but they're also involved in the early development of photography. All of them had a role in early photography in Australia, and there are works, scholarly monographs on their work in that particular regard as well. So they're multifaceted. Not only did they contribute in terms of economic development, but also in terms of cultural development in Australia. So they really did make a significant contribution. And the one who made a very, very public contribution, which exists to this day, of course, was Eleazar Montefiore. He was a bit of a hero of mine. He's a remarkable man. As I say, he came to Australia in 1843, first to Adelaide to work as a commission agent, and then moved into insurance. He married his cousin, Esther Hannah Barrow Montefiore, in 1848, and they moved to Melbourne in 1849. And he, of course, kept up his business activities there. But he also became one of Australia's first etchers. He was a talented artist. He also worked in charcoal and pen and ink. And the picture there was one of his well-known works called Melbourne from the Falls, 1837. He, of course, wasn't here then, but he copied it from some work by a man called S.T. Gill and added a few features. But the interesting thing about this picture is it's depicting the First Nations people of Melbourne, who were no longer there. They had been moved elsewhere. But he was very sympathetic to the plight of Australia's First Nations people and depicted them sympathetically in his works. He was also a founding trustee of the Public Library Museums and National Gallery of Victoria, now, of course, the State Library of Victoria, the Melbourne Museum, and the National Gallery, as it's still called, of Victoria, and a member of the Victorian Academy of Arts. So he was very much involved with the cultural life of Melbourne in these, and part of a group of businessmen who really promoted culture in Australia. The Melbourne years were very successful. There's a picture of him in his youth, of course, with a tasseled hat. But then he went to Sydney, where things became even more prominent. He moved to Sydney in 1871 to manage another insurance company, but his first love was art and creating public institutions. And he got together with other Sydney businessmen to form the New South Wales Academy of Art in 1871 and began to build a collection. And it was interesting because many of the other trustees wanted to buy and did buy big name works from England, particularly by works from the school of the pre-Raphaelites that was very fashionable at the time. But he also encouraged them to buy works by local artists, which was an interesting departure from their usual preoccupation. From this beginnings grew the Art Gallery of New South Wales, one of our great cultural institutions. Eleazar Montefiore became the first director in 1892, served in his position until he died in 1894, but he was effectively director for a long time before that. This was his official position, but he had been de facto director for many, many years, really. A portrait bust of Montefiore, which you can see there in the picture, by Theodora Cohen, greeted the Australian Art Gallery New South Wales visitors for many years. And Hugh Hudson, who's written many articles on Montefiore, has said his role in the foundation of the Art Gallery of New South Wales must be regarded as his most important achievement. So and of course, the Art Gallery of New South Wales has just recently had an enormous expansion. It's now called Sydney Modern, or the extension is, and it is a really astonishing cultural institution, which owes its origins very much to Eleazar Montefiore. So these are basically a wrap up of the people who are prominent in Australian life, or were prominent in Australian life, and do have origins in Barbados. There'll be many others who are not so prominent, who are not featuring in, for example, in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. And I'm sure there are many other stories that could be excavated from our public records and other sources to establish links between Australia and Barbados. But these are the ones that probably are the most prominent, the ones that are best known, and the ones where we can really demonstrate that people from Barbados or with Barbadian connections made a contribution to the development of what is now, of course, the nation of Australia. So we have a lot to be thankful for here from those people with Barbadian connections. I mean, particularly the sugar industry, as Harriet mentioned earlier, who would have shown them how to make sugar if John Buho hadn't, for example, come there and shown them direct from Barbados. And we, of course, the cultural institutions that we owe to people like Eleazar Montefiore. So, and of course, the contributions by people like Haynes Gibbs Aline to public health in Australia are also significant. So hats off to Barbados for producing people who have been so helpful in the development of this country. If you want to find out about Barbadians in Australia, there are a number of different sources. I've mentioned the Australian Dictionary of Biography several times. This is our go-to source, of course, for most biographical information, particularly of nationally significant individuals. The online version of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, which is what everyone uses, of course, these days, also has material from Obituaries Australia. So even if someone hasn't got an entry themselves, their obituary will appear, which gives you very useful biographical information. The other aspect of an entry in the Australian Dictionary of Biography is that it lists all the descendants that it has records for or knows about. So that is another way of establishing family connections and drawing genealogical tables. The Society of Australian Genealogists, their web address is there, is a wonderful institution. I worked with them last year on a project, and they have fabulous collection. They have a catalogue called the Midas catalogue that can be, I think you can actually put a query through their website and they will respond to you. You might need to join to get the further level information, but they are very helpful. They have a wonderful team of volunteers who are very, very adept in research, including the next person down, Danielle Lautrec, who was their research officer, who's just written a book called The Good Genealogist. And this is available as an ebook. It's highly recommended. I think it gives you all the principles of family history research. Monument Australia website is a historical and educational research site which records public monuments and memorials. I found the Haynes Gibbs Aline Monument and the Buho Monument on Monuments Australia. So if you have someone who is likely to be commemorated on a monument, Monument Australia will have information on that. Another resource too, which I found useful, and in fact, it's not, of course, Australian, but it's the Centre for the Studies of the Legacies of British Slavery. And you can enter something in this, and often it will bring up information on people in Australia who received compensation payments after emancipation. And they often reference people in Australia and give biographical details. So that is another good source, actually, for information on people from in Australia who originally have Caribbean backgrounds. When I was working with the Society of Australian Genealogists, there was a wonderful set of records by a family called Marsh and Pinnock, who had a plantation in Jamaica. And their story came up on the Centre of the Study of Legacies of British Slavery. Their records, of course, are held in the Society of Australian Genealogists. I didn't find any Barbadian ones, but I'm sure some would be there in that wonderful collection. The Australian State Record Offices also hold information on birth, deaths and marriages, and they are online. National Archives of Australia has all the war records of World War I soldiers. If anyone had any connection with someone who might have served in the Australian forces, I think they're digitising Second World War ones as we speak. So there's a number of online sources for research. Of course, there's the classic ancestry and other things like that you will know about. But it's possible to get quite a lot of information out of these sources, even without going down to the next level of detailed genealogical research. So if you're interested in those connections, if you know somebody who has Australian connections that you want to trace, there's a number of ways in which you can do it. And I'm sure that the Society of Australian Genealogists will be able to help you with any more queries. So thank you for listening and for your interest in Barbadian Australian links. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. You know, you said that wherever you go, you will find a Bajan. Even if you go in North Pole, you will find a Bajan. So thank you for giving us a snapshot of the Barbadians who migrated to Australia and what they would have done in the society. I will open the floor now for anyone who wishes to ask a question or make a comment. While that is happening, can you tell us a bit, are you prepared to tell us a bit about Dalradian boxing in Australia?
About, sorry?
The Black Diamond, the boxing.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I did research him for the dictionary, but I didn't mention him in this story, unfortunately. I think he was a boxing champion in Queensland. From my memory, I don't have the information here at the moment, but yes, I should have mentioned him because he was another significant Barbadian. But I think there's an entry I wrote for the Dictionary of Barbados biography, but I haven't got my hands on a copy of it right now, unfortunately. But it will be appearing in that publication. But he was a notable boxer, and he was a Bajan. Yes, indeed, the Black Diamond. but unfortunately, I'm sorry I missed him out. But yes, there will be an entry for him in the dictionary of biography.
Thank you
But
so
yes,
much.
sporting heroes, of course, we should have mentioned them, and of course the classic sporting connection with Barbados is of course your national hero, Sir Garfield Sobers,
Oh,
who
yes.
at one stage captained the South Australian cricket team and
Mhm.
was at one point married to an Australian lady. So there are those other sporting connections as well. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So are there any comments, any questions from those of you in the Zoom or on Facebook Live? We will give persons a couple minutes. We don't seem to be, okay, there's a question. Okay, there's a question from Cleanup Bim. Is there any relation between the Gibbs being discussed and the present day Gibbs in Barbados?
I'm not sure the answer to that one. Stephen Gibbs, I think, did come over to see people in Barbados, but I'm not. He unfortunately he passed away, and I haven't. So he has a family, at least a daughter, who may have connections with Barbados, but because he passed away about 12 years ago, of course we haven't got any more information. But it's very likely, given that he came across to Barbados before he passed away in 2011, it's very likely that there would be family that he may have contacted to come to Barbados. But there's no mention of who they actually are, unfortunately. I mean, are there members of the Gibbs family still living in Barbados? I'm not sure.
Yes, there's still Gibbs family. That's still a name very much on our namescape in Barbados. But I think what we want to establish is that you were showing the historical links between that Gibbs family in the 19th century who went to
Yes.
Australia. And of course,
Yes.
there may or may not be descendants of that particular branch of the family in
Exactly.
Barbados. Right. So that was the reason for making those connections, the historical connections
Yes.
to the Gibbs family.
Yes, I mean, the connections, of course, are fairly, I mean, the interesting thing about Stephen Gibbs was that he was so invested in the Barbadian connection. He was very very keen to make that link. I mean, it may have been that most of the family had long since gone, but he was very keen to make that connection between the two countries. He always talked about the fact that Colonel Gibbs came from a Barbadian family, and so this was very important to him. So, but whether that family still exists in Barbados, I can't honestly say, to be honest.
Right. But yes, I guess that would take some research to find out if the Gibbs family we know now, how and to what extent they're connected to that historical Gibbs family. But of course, Gibbs
Exactly.
is very much there and it's still a popular area for sea bathers and a popular area for holiday villas and so on in St. Peter.
Yes, yes.
Let's see if we have some questions. Well, some comments, some persons thanking you for the presentation. Right, oh, there's someone from Canberra who says, nice to learn about my now local history here in Canberra. So you have
I wonder who that is.
someone called Jennifer.
Okay.
Okay, well, it don't seem as though there are any other questions, but of course, if you think of anything else that you will wish to ask and for me to direct to Rosalind, you just send me an email. My email address is library. Let me just type it in, library@barbnews.org.bb. Library Barb News. Right, so by all means, you can send me your question or your comment, and I will, or there's a spelling error there. It's just one org, not two G's in the org, .bb. And I will direct your question or comment to Rosalind, who I'm sure will be willing to answer. So I just want to, right, no more questions. So I just want to thank Rosalind for taking the time out this morning to speak with us and to share your knowledge. I think it's very much appreciated. And I think persons get to understand that Barbados, a very small island, we've had some significant influences on other parts of the world. And I think people appreciate knowing these hidden histories. So thank you so much. And we wish you all the best.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Harriet. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for listening too. Thank you.
Thank you. For those of you out there, our next meeting is scheduled for March 16th. And Professor Pedro Welch will speak on the Barbados-Trinidad connection. If you realize, we started this these talks looking at Barbados and connections in different parts of the world in January last year. So we are still trying to put that information out there. So next March the 16th, Professor Welch will speak on the Barbados-Trinidad connection. So thank you all for being here with us. Thank you, Rosalind. Thank the audience. Thanks, Elena, for being our technical guru. And I wish you all the best. I will see you in March. Have a good evening. Bye and be safe. Bye.